The word why. What a curious word. The kind of word that can make us cringe, feel defensive, or even distant. But you know, sometimes why is the key. The key that can unlock so much to our lives. Join me as we explore the why with fascinating contributors to the world. Those that entertain us, inform us, teach us about life, and if we're lucky, inspire the next in all of us. I'm your host, Dr. Rod Berger, and welcome to HeadRoom, a production of Rainlight and co-produced by Old Soul. Let's go. Hey, everyone. Boy, do I hope you like this podcast episode. You know, it's funny because as someone who loves story, sometimes I have to remind myself that you have to pull the pieces, the characters, the storylines, the plot lines together. And if you can do that, maybe, just maybe you can lay something out that means something to someone, impacts somebody, changes direction in a very positive manner. And that's what we're going to try to do today. You know, look, if I piece it together, I have conversations with people, what feels like every day, about sustainability, about Gen Z, about the next generation and what they're doing in education. And do we have the career paths established? Do we know what we're doing with AI? How will that change or shift thinking from the next generation and what they're looking to do and how they want to live their lives? And so this is a culmination of those conversations. I'm spending time with Ken Janssens. He is the co-founder of this relatively new company, Windō. He's the former chief data officer at JP Morgan. You know what Windō does? Windō, and we'll get into this in the podcast, they basically pull together all the ESG, the DE&I reports of corporations around the world so that young people, so anybody, but primarily the next generation can go in and see where these folks score. What are they doing to make a difference? Let me just throw some stats out that came out in the interview. I could not believe this. When we think about Gen Z and what they're looking for in their careers, Windō did some research. 23% of Gen Z, you know what they do? They go to Wikipedia before they interview. They check out to see if there are controversies related to the company that they're interviewing at. Just let that sit in for a second. Not about the product or how well they're doing. They want to know, like, in essence, what's the story? What's the full story? Are they being transparent? 72% of Gen Z say that it's important to work at organizations whose values are aligned with theirs. Again, we're not talking about the product or solution that they're offering the marketplace or the industry. It's about values. And I'll close with this one. 93% of graduates want to make a difference in their job, favoring companies with sustainable policies. That should reverberate through the airwaves because that impacts the story that the C-suite, that CEOs are telling prospects, their market, their consumers, their customers. So I hope you really enjoy this. We take a lot of sort of dips and turns into the conversation. Ken is incredibly transparent. He brings just a wonderful wealth of knowledge, and he's a likable guy. Enjoy. For those of you that have listened to my podcast over the years, you know, you see sort of this evolution of story and the elements that, you know, look, selfishly, I'm doing this, so I want to tell the stories and talk to the people that fascinate me. And sometimes I just get really, really lucky. And I opened up an email, I think it was maybe in the last 2 weeks, from a company that there was something about it. And I said, I need to dig in here. And granted, I guest lecture with graduate students, and I've been doing that for almost 2 decades. And I'm having offline conversations with young people with Gen Z about what they're looking for in a career path, what they're nervous about, what they're fearful about when we think about traditional careers that maybe, you know, derive from their family members, the communities that they're in, you know, a legacy, because those legacies are being challenged now by all sorts of things, not to mention AI. And so today we're going to be talking to Ken Janssens. He is co-founder of Windō, and he's also the former chief data officer at JP Morgan. Now, for those of you who are listening saying, okay, so this is just a corporate conversation. Well, one, you don't know me and you don't know this podcast, because this is really, really an important conversation. I'm going to give a little bit more background on Ken, and then I'm going to let him do justice on Windō and what they're doing and how powerful. I feel like I've just stumbled into a gold mine in what Windō does. But like I said, he was at JP Morgan Chase for almost 25 years. I don't mean to date you there, Ken. And he was a trailblazer. He founded the JP Morgan Chase's LGBTQ plus Executive Council. He's lived and worked in Tokyo, Sao Paulo, London, and New York, and is a former board chair at Out and Equal, a leading nonprofit focused on LGBTQ plus workplace inclusion. You really haven't been sitting down, have you, Ken? And what I mean by that is you approach life standing up, and with forward momentum. We were talking off air about all of the data points that are out there. How are we going to assess and impact Gen Z's decisions? And I would contend really their level of satisfaction in sort of life writ large, because work is 24/7. You don't turn it off anymore. It's not an American thing at all. I think it's just sort of a global marketplace, or a condition of the global marketplace. That's a long way of saying it's great to spend some time with you. And, a lot of times interviews, I feel like I have a path I want to go down. We've got about 7 that I'd love to go down. We're going to dive into DE&I. We're going to talk about ESG. Can you give the 10,000 foot on Windō and the data points, and in essence, why you co-founded Windō now?
Right. Well, first of all, Rod, really pleased to be here with you and your audience. So when maybe if I just go back a little bit, and I'll start at the pandemic. And like so many during the pandemic, I really reflected on kind of what mattered to me. And at that point, I was thinking 24 years at JP Morgan, career was going extremely well. But I started to think. And I came to the realization as we kind of returned to work that it was time for a change. So my husband and I, we both quit our jobs. We bought an RV, sorry to be predictable, and we went traveling around Europe with our 2 dogs for 11 months. And, coming out of such an intense 25-year career, and you're right, I do find it quite difficult to sit still. So I started doing some research in the back of my RV on my laptop. And considering all of the DEI work that I had done at JP Morgan, I started looking at JP Morgan's ESG report. And I was particularly interested in how DEI showed up in that report. And then I started looking at a few other banks. And then before I knew it, I built a spreadsheet with DEI data for all Fortune 100 companies. And I also started to read a lot more about ESG and kind of trying to become more knowledgeable. And one of the things that I learned was that this data is obviously important for investors, but they're not the only people that care about this data. Young people in particular care about it. With half of Gen Z looking at a company sustainability report when they're researching a potential employer. But my co-founder, Ollie, and I, we were really surprised not to find a single platform where that data was easily accessible for young talent. So that's really how Windō was born.
How do we, so I want to dive into the data, because, and can you talk about the mechanics? So in essence, you can go on there and really pull the data, right? So I mean, look, in America, we have these, and maybe I'm way off the ranch here, but, we have ways where we can compare insurance companies, right? Where they're basically stacked next to one another in this chart. And you can say, well, this is the one that I want because it fits my specific needs. I mean, we're sort of talking about that just from a pair, like that's the frame, right? Is that I can go in and explore where these companies land in these different areas, these different metrics that are important to me.
Correct. I mean, think of Windō as the Glassdoor for sustainability, or the Trustpilot of sustainability. So we build these profiles, and we define sustainability with 3 verticals: environment, DEI, and well-being. We basically pull mostly from companies' own reports, but those reports are notoriously difficult to digest. The average sustainability report for a FTSE 100 company is 113 pages. So if we calculated that takes the average reader about 3 hours to read cover to cover. Who has
Nobody's going to
time
do that.
and it's all in different formats. So that's what we've done. We've standardized it. We've made it bit sized so that it's easily consumable. It's actually a mobile first app. So we actually think the mobile experience is the best one because you just go through single tiles. And you can basically in 15 to 20 minutes get a really good sense if the company is really committed to planet and people. And we also pull in some other sources other than the company's reports. So we pull in public statements that they've made, maybe in favor of racial justice, LGBTQ rights, women's rights. We also pull in external recognition from very reputable kind of awards that they've received as an inclusive employer, so that when you look at that profile, it becomes very complete, and there's that external validation and that external commitment that companies have made is very visible.
Talk about the response that you've gotten on two sides. One, from the company side, right, the data side. If you've gotten responses, I'd be curious. I would imagine this could impact at some level the data that they explore and then report on, because now I'm not going to say they're being held to account, but maybe they're also being, highlighted because they're doing some great work. And then also the response from the end user that is scrolling through the app. Do we have a way we can glean into what the impact might be?
Yeah. So, we're literally just launching, but in the pre-launch, just on the end user side, we've so far, without any advertising spend, we have 22,000, kind of organic users that we've attracted. So quite a bit of interest. And then, yes, we are talking to a lot of companies, and we're getting really good feedback. People really love it. We've been at careers fairs, big ones. We were at the Out and Equal Workplace Summit, which has 4,000 people. And interestingly, we had some people that were working at a company already and said, "Oh yeah, can you pull up my company?" And then we showed their data, and I was like, "I had no idea." So they work for the company,
And they
had no idea, because probably they themselves don't want to read the 113-page sustainability report. But it's so yeah, we've had really, really good feedback. And I would say, yes, I think there is also an element that, and we really want to help companies with that, to tell their sustainability story. Because, when it comes to the environment, there's a lot of standards that are published that tell companies, okay, you should report on this, this, and this. But when it comes to DEI, which is really the S in the ESG, the sort of guidance is very lacking. You're lucky if the guidance goes much beyond gender and race. Very little on disability, LGBTQ, veterans, socioeconomic background. But these are all really important dimensions of diversity. So, and what we've been able to do at Windō, by looking at those companies that are saying, forget those standards which are lacking, we're going to get our story out there. We can kind of highlight those companies that are really doing well. And then their competitors can go, "Oh, they're reporting on that. We should maybe consider that as well." And that's the kind of change definitely that we want to bring about.
Let's have you put on your corporate hat. So in essence, go back in time prior to Windō. Look, data, and I'd love for you to challenge me on this. You're comfortable with data, right? And I think that data is the kind of thing that if you go into a hardware store, you're either comfortable or you're not, because you grew up and it didn't scare you to go in and look for all kinds of tools and these sorts of things. I think data is a lot like that. If we get an early experience with it, we get comfortable, now we're going to utilize it and we're going to understand how to apply it. I'm wondering, just your perspective from the corporate space. We are pulling in data. Some of it is maybe less than what we would like, but it's going to hopefully grow over time with, innovations like Windō and solutions like Windō. But how do we feel? What's our confidence level regarding the corporations and the way in which they can distill down the data they're collecting, and then how that may or may not impact the talent strategies that they have moving forward? Because the stats are, they're exploding about Gen Z. right? If there's ever a
Mhm.
generation, they're the first generation that is putting purpose over profits, which is, I think, for our generation, it really is tough to wrap our heads around, right? We care. I think a lot of us do care, but we were raised to understand a ladder, right? There's an image of
Mm.
climbing a ladder. There's an image of that there are steps that you take, and they're saying, I don't care about those steps, right? We're gonna
Mm.
take an entirely different route. And now it feels like corporations have to not just have, you know, a sustainable sort of product in the market over time that supports a workforce, but they kind of have to sell the environment, their culture
Mm.
in a way that I don't think they did in the past, right? The power differential was incredibly different. So, where's your confidence level with regards to corporations being able to distill down the data and
Mm.
understand it? Because I think there's a big difference between, in essence, reporting and understanding.
Yeah, and I mean, one thing I would say is, before I answer that question, is we try and strike a balance between the quantitative and the qualitative in Windows. So if you look at a company's profile, you will hopefully see that come through. Yes, we share the, for instance, gender, workforce data over time. Do they set any targets? What about their gender pay gap data? But what we also pull in are kind of more the softer things, like do they have a vlog on the lived experience of an LGBTQ person at their company? Do they have a vlog on what it's like to be a disabled person? So we try and strike that balance because we know that Gen Z will look at both. And what's interesting is we know that a lot of companies are maybe afraid to put out their data because Gen Z are not going to like it. But we have a network of 400 university society leaders in the UK. So we really feel like we're plugged into what they're thinking. And interestingly, they're not looking for perfection. They're looking for transparency and commitment. And are the companies making progress? So, I think it's okay for companies to share, even if where they are now is maybe not where they'd like to be. But if they can show year over year progress and they're just chipping away at and moving the dial on DEI is extremely difficult. One thing I've learned working at JP Morgan for 25 years. But I think I know that when Gen Z can see, okay, you're making progress, that's what they want to see. They're not looking for the perfect environment. They're looking for an environment where there's commitment and there's progress.
So, anytime people pull together data, uh, I think those that are in data and just business sort of in general, as we think about, data can be very valuable because you can apply it to other, sort of methodologies, approaches, quite big questions that are hanging out there. I would think that in a world where now Window exists, and in a world where we have social impact investing, right, where you have young people wanting to know, am I going to invest in a company that has a board that is representative of the world that I live in? Um, you know, if I'm in retail, I'm wondering how the data that you have might impact, right? So if I'm an early career professional and I'm picking a corporation and they sort of match my lifestyle and what I'm looking for in purpose, I would then maybe extrapolate that could impact everything from how I, sort of fill my flat or my apartment with furniture. Where do I buy it? Is it a company that's sustainable? Do you think we're going to get to a place where we can sort of step back and analyze that data and see some, I'm not going to say causality, but that there's something going on. There's an ecosystem that we didn't realize that was out there, and it is building and it's rich with nutrients. And we need to harvest that and understand that better.
Yeah. So I actually recently wrote a research report for an organization called Open for Business. It was actually a report that was published at Davos a few weeks ago. And what I did there, the report is called the LGBTQ. The Investor Guide to LGBT Inclusion. And what I did in that report is I specifically looked at the data points, uh, 13 data points in sustainability reports, and I analyzed 300 um, of the largest listed companies in the US, UK, Germany, and Australia. And what I was able to prove is that the top 25 that were the most transparent about LGBTQ DEI were 2.3 times more profitable than the bottom 25.
2.3.
2.3. And I looked at I looked at profit as a percentage of revenue, and that is a measure you need to be careful with because that differs by industry. But I back tested it at the industry level, and it held up. And the other interesting thing that I found was that the diversity outcomes were also better for the more transparent companies. They had larger LGBTQ workforces than those that were less transparent. And then finally, they were more admired as companies. And what I used there was a proxy of the Fortune's world's most admired companies, and many more that had a high LGBTQ transparency score featured in that list than in the bottom 25. So, and we have to be careful here. This is correlation, not causation.
Yeah, an important point.
But it was really fascinating to see. And if that's true for LGBTQ, I'm nearly certain it's true for all diverse groups.
Isn't there a fantastic irony? I would say that we're potentially relatively in the same age bracket and generation. And, we grew up, it was like, if you think about it, sort of broad strokes, companies, if you were Pepsi, you wanted to get Pepsi in the hands of kids as early as you could, because then they would choose Pepsi over Coke. And it was based on the product, right? Sort of that's how you created this affinity for a brand. And yet, my goodness, how the narrative has flipped and changed. And it's like, okay, yes, the product is there, but is company X, is industry X inclusive in the way in which I want to live my life? And, the product almost becomes secondary to the reason why you may or may not choose a place of employment. I think it's a fantastic story, but I do think there are implications for the young people that are still in classrooms. They're not on campuses at institutions of higher learning, but they are truly in secondary school, middle school, high school in the US, and these sorts of things. And are we going to be prepared to connect those dots? The fear in me as a parent is they're going to sort of walk out of the door, sort of come graduation and say, okay, it's a barren landscape. Where do I apply the things that I learned and the way in which the filters in which the information came to me to a world where it's incredibly different? So that is a backdrop. Ken, help me understand the story. Harvard Business Review, it feels like almost every other cover is around the power of story. And that the companies that are going to make it and that are going to thrive are going to have to understand how to integrate story, right? We're in a hybrid world. We're in a global economy. You've got, if you map culture and strategy together, the only way you're going to do that is by telling a story, a rich story of who you are and these sorts of elements. How do we support companies and corporations and industries to tell a more transparent, to your point, narrative that is inclusive not only of those that are there now, but those that are sort of waiting in the wings that they hope will be a part of their talent pipeline?
Yeah, I'm really pleased that you've raised the topic of storytelling, the importance. And I know that's a big part of your podcast. I think storytelling is probably the most effective way to change hearts and minds. And I've, particularly at JP Morgan in the last decade, you could try and appeal to people, say, for instance, on, racial justice or on LGBTQ, and, you will get some success. But there's nothing more powerful than having someone tell their sort of lived experience. In the aftermath of George Floyd's murder, this was happening across companies all around the world where, for the first time for many employees, they got to hear some very raw stories from Black colleagues. And it created a change. People were like, I had no idea. And I've seen that through all of the work that I did with Equal, which focuses very heavily on that storytelling, we can, and this is what unfortunately the right is trying to do in the US. They're trying to, for instance, dehumanize trans people. But it's very difficult to dehumanize when you can actually listen to a trans person and what's their journey been like, how, what have they had to go through. Most people have empathy, and when they can see what life has been like, then usually there's something that clicks, and people will be more open, more receptive, more supportive. And I think, I know JP Morgan does a lot of this. In fact, if you go to the Windō profile of JP Morgan, like for every diverse group, you will find a vlog that talks about that. So, and that's definitely something that at Windō we encourage companies to do, is like, yeah, give us the, publish the hard data, but, share real people that work in your company and have them talk. It's so powerful.
I'm so glad you brought look, these are some difficult conversations, and I'm curious as to your perspective. And it doesn't matter to me if it's a professional or personal hat, or just someone who has been in the industry and really had your eye on sort of the heartbeat, right? That goes beyond the ones and zeros. I'm glad you brought up sort of how these different, these movements, ESG, DE&I, and belonging, and that's an important piece. I know that's important, that element that you add, the belonging element to DE&I. I'm wondering, how do we parse out within the data, and maybe we can't, right? And maybe this is country or region or even locally specific. The rhetoric, right? And sort of this, and the word that came to my mind was almost weaponization, right? That, you can't, I remember getting phone calls, Ken, about ESG and corporations that I will not name that were very curious about telling stories through podcasts just to illustrate that they were really sort of pro ESG. Like I was getting, they were, and some of them were in the financial sector, thinking we've got to tell a different story. Maybe we just do some regular podcasting about that shows that we care. And now I'm having people say to me offline, "Oh, we can't talk about DE&I," or ESG was, that was sort of then. It's not now. I've even had people that I've been shocked at that say to me, "Well, what's ESG?" And I'm thinking, okay, so how do we, it's like AI. I'll give you an example with AI. I've interviewed a lot of people in the AI space. And sometimes I'll hear in the news, people say, well, the fad of AI. Well, when you talk to experts, there's nothing fad about AI. Our world is forever changed because of AI. And we don't have to talk about that and sort of judge the benefits or the perils associated with maybe an AI world. But why is it that people are thinking that ESG or DE&I, if we just sort of wait it out, we kick the can down the field, we can get past it? And that says to me more about sort of the cultures that we're coming from than the very sort of intervention or the approach to a more inclusive world that utilizes an ESG or DEI and belonging does. Just your perspective on that.
Well, there's a lot to unpack there, but let me first start by saying I'm kind of happy that ESG has become a dirty word, and that it's being dropped as I'll tell you why. I think it's an unhelpful construct, because yes, environment, social governance, I can see why they created it, but that immediately creates silos. And the truth is there's interdependence between them. And by you're just sort of separating them in the outset. And I think that's unhelpful. So I think sustainable is a much better word, because one, it's not an acronym. Everyone can get behind and understand, okay, something is sustainable or it's not. So will our business be here in 10 years or 15 years? Or what we're doing, is it sustainable? And then it becomes a very simple kind of question. And you can talk about, should we do something about environmental impact? Because maybe if we keep going, then we might not be around here anymore. Or should we have a company that represents the communities that we serve? Or maybe there'll be a backlash and we won't be around here anymore. So I'm sort of, happy that ESG is going away. And I think there's a really simple way for companies to sort of deal with all of this rhetoric, and just call it their impact report. How are they impacting the world? Like, don't call it ESG because yes, they'll attack you. But talk about impact. And then and this is what people love to say, which is, focus on shareholders. ESG is moving away from that. Well, no, actually not, because if you're not sustainable in the long term, your shareholders are not going to be happy with you. So I think that's sort of one thing to it. And I would also say there are many companies that are going to stay the course on DEI and ESG. And quite frankly, it's a golden opportunity for them to get even further ahead from their competitors. So, there were those that were kind of maybe just starting on their DEI journey or ESG journey, and now they're sort of pulling back. But there are companies that have been at this for more than a decade, and they're going to keep going, and it's going to create more of a competitive advantage. So, my advice to companies: this is actually an opportunity, and I don't want it to be, but I think that's what it will be. And one final statistic that I will share, which I think is fascinating, and again, it was in that recent Davos report I wrote. When I looked at those 300 companies, I analyzed their materiality assessments. And for, materiality assessment is basically the starting point of a sustainability strategy, is where you kind of map out what are the key material issues that matter to us as a company and to our stakeholders. And then you kind of map them. And then if they're sort of in the top right-hand quadrant, they're important to the company and important to stakeholders. And that's what a company then focuses on. And then, the sustainability strategy follows from that. 92% of companies place DEI in that top right-hand quadrant. That means that 92% of these companies consider DEI to be something, if they don't tackle seriously, they won't be around in the long term. So, sit with that for just 30 seconds. That means that, like, how could a company now suddenly go, well, we're going to throw DEI out of that matrix because it's become a hot potato? No, it's already baked into that. This is really important to us. So I find it really difficult to imagine a massive reversal. I think we will see change on the margin. And unfortunately, this rhetoric is from a very loud minority that gets too much airtime.
Too much airtime. So well said. When we talk about story, one of the things I sometimes think that we forget, which is sort of ironic here, is we forget the storyteller. And given what you just talked about, 92%, and actually that gives me hope. That's like the statistic of the day, Ken. I really appreciate that because, if I was just doing a sort of a straw poll, that would not be what I would have thought. So that is very encouraging. But I'm wondering if, we think about this in all kinds of, I think, roles. We think about it in athletics. We think about it in entertainment, but personality types. And I don't mean to sort of push this into a box, but I'm wondering if when we think about sort of the CEOs of the future or the C-suite of the future, is a skill that we're going to have to check a box on when we are searching for that next. They're going to have to be a relatively good and engaging storyteller. Because, if you think about sort of traditional leadership development, and we looked at the different types of CEOs and leaders, and it was, you could be, in essence, the data individual, right? You could be sort of that operational CEO. But I don't know, from what I'm hearing, if that's going to be, if I'm on a board somewhere, I may want my CEO, my chief executive, to have some ability to communicate emotionally.
Yeah.
right? With
Yeah, no,
poise and purpose and direction and precision. And that to me is a very talented storyteller. And so I'm just wondering if we, sort of thinking broadly, if we look down the runway, do you, am I way off on this, or do you think that there's
no,
some merit?
no, I think there's a lot of merit. And by the way, I think this has sort of been in the making for some time. Um, I used to manage very large teams at JP Morgan, and I used to joke with my team, you don't have to be a jerk to be successful. And it's something that I've lived by for a very long time. Um, so, you know, I, I, I agree with you. Storytelling will be really important. Winning hearts and minds is going to be really key. And, being authentic, not trying to kind of be that cookie cutter image of kind of a corporate leader, you know, bring your whole self to work, and be vulnerable as well. I think it's such an important quality. Something that we focus on. It's one of our sort of more edgy features in Windō. We have, and we don't have it for many companies, and I will explain why. We have a tile called mistakes. And so we have it for a couple. If you want to, Disney is a good example. Um, because we know that Gen Z really care about that. They, just to give you a statistic, we ran a survey um, amongst university society presidents, and 23% go to Wikipedia to look at controversies of a company before they apply. They do their homework. They're actively looking for this. So our point at Windō is, if you know that that's what they're doing, why not get ahead of this and actually communicate about that yourself? Because otherwise, you're letting some platform like Wikipedia set the tone and tell the story.
And control the narrative.
And control the narrative. So companies, no company is perfect. And I think it's really important to recognize, and it's part of what you were talking about. What are those qualities? Not the quality is not we're perfect, we never make mistakes. Yeah, we do, and we got it wrong, and we're going to do better. And the Disney example is a really great one. It's a very famous one. Don't say gay. The previous CEO really, didn't handle that very well. But then Disney kind of dug deep and said, we got this wrong. We are going to do better. Luckily, they had a very long history of being very LGBT inclusive. So I think that helped them sort of weather the storm. But they have a statement on their website where they kind of explain that and say, we got this wrong, and here's what we're going to do better going forward. And we link to that from Windō. And we think that's a really important kind of thing for companies to do. So companies apologizing isn't necessarily something that you will find. We've spent a lot of time searching for it, but we do, I would say, we track 500 companies right now in Windō. And I think at this point we have about 24 where that mistakes tile is populated. And we'll just keep adding to it because, one, we think that makes Windō more valuable to Gen Z, but also we think as part of, how a company should position itself, it's an important thing to get right.
Let's, as we put a bow on this conversation, I want to kind of go back to what I said at the outset, which was that my sense of you is that you don't live life sitting down, right? You're about putting yourself out there to not just experience life for yourself in a more enriching way, but to help others. And I'm just wondering, at this point in your career, right, to make the decision that you made, that both you and your husband made, to quit your jobs and to really give back, but to partake in the next chapter, I think, evolution of who we are and how we understand the inner workings of work and home and culture and environment. And I'm just wondering, there are people out there that I've talked to that, let's say that they grew up during World War II, and they've said to me things like, I just feel like I got dropped into the world at sort of the wrong section of the book. It felt like, gosh, if I had just been able to skip ahead a few decades, maybe I would have had a different life. And I'm wondering, when you think about your purpose and you think about meaning, I get the
Mm.
sense that you were dropped into sort of the exact section of the book to realize your full potential, because you really had a training course at JP Morgan for a quarter of a century, and you've applied that now to not just making a difference for you and your family, but for, my goodness, you could say, I'll say it, for people across the world in really meaningful ways. And I just wonder how that lands for you when you think about the decision that you made, and you reflect on the contributions that you have, that you've given to so many people in so many different disciplines and areas of their life.
Yeah. Well, I think the key thing is I'm incredibly grateful for my time with JP Morgan. I was the first person in my family ever to go to university. Um, and so me joining JP Morgan, at the age of 22, it was a real moment. But it didn't stop there. And by the way, I'll just share this because it's funny. Um, because I am from a different generation, all I needed was to see a glossy brochure with glitzy Wall Street skyscrapers. And I was like, where
You
do
were
I
in.
sign on? I was in. I wasn't looking for that sustainability report. But but at the same time, JP Morgan had such a profound impact on me. I was sent on these expat assignments to New York, to Tokyo, Sao Paulo. So they really shaped my identity and my worldview. And the culture of JP Morgan is so strong. It really had a profound impact on me. Um, but also, um, I was allowed to bring myself to work. I was able to come out at work back in 2000. Um, and the culture, and that was in London. And so the culture was that strong that when I arrived in Tokyo in 2002 and in Sao Paulo in 2008, I knew I had the company's back, that I could continue to bring my whole self. Didn't matter where that was, that extended everywhere. And so when I arrived in Sao Paulo in 2008, I quickly realized I was the only openly gay employee in an office of 1,000 employees. So I knew that was statistically impossible. So, but also I was, relatively senior at that point. And I also felt it was time to give back to the company that allowed me to be me for that long and thrive as a result. So I launched an LGBTQ employee resource group with one member uh, back then at the bank in Brazil. And now that is a thriving group. I mean, more than half of the office is a member of that group, allies and LGBTQ people. And that was really the beginning for me, as my journey as an activist leader. My sort of, I often joke my gay job became bigger than my day job. And so I did so many things, and you mentioned some at the start, um, launching the LGBT Executive Council at JP Morgan, which at the time had 12 members of the most senior LGBT executives. And when I left JP Morgan, there were 400 LGBT managing directors and executive directors. So I felt like, okay, my work is done here. I can move on. But to sort of answer your question, I also realized at some point, and like many corporate leaders, that there was a point in my career where I actually realized it was no longer about what I produced. It was about lifting and enabling the people around me that was going to lead to a much greater impact. And I know many others kind of reached that point when that penny drops. And so I really wish I had a tool like Windō 25 years ago at my fingertips when I was researching who I wanted to work for. And I really enjoyed working with young talent at JP Morgan. I mentored many over the years. So the fact that I now get to work with young talent every single day, and I can combine it with my passion for data and DEI, this is exactly what I want to be doing in this next phase of my professional career.
Really enjoyed that conversation. Ken taught me a lot. I mean, I took notes in this conversation, this interview, like I haven't taken in quite some time. I feel like I couldn't write fast enough based on the things that he was inspiring me to think about, statistics that were reflective of what Windō does. This probably could have been a 3-part podcast, but it wasn't. So for those that are interested to learn more, I really encourage you, check out Windō. It's csrwindō.com. That's CSR spelled WINDO. .com, and the statistics are incredible. I mentioned it at the outset. One thing that really stuck with me with Ken when he talked about sort of this, the nomenclature of sustainability, of sort of what are we doing to make a difference? And I just love that he said, why don't we just call it an impact report? How subtle, right? Sometimes, like we've always been told, sometimes it's the simplest answer that gets us to where we want to go. It helps us cross the finish line, meet new people, experience new adventures. But an impact report, because an impact report allows me as a CEO, a storytelling CEO, to actually think about the way in which we're laying out the information that reflects the spirit, the mission, the vision of what we're trying to accomplish. I just love that. There were so many just wonderful nuggets in here, and learning about sort of this cross, continent RV trip that Ken and his husband took. That alone, we probably could have had a podcast on, and just the sights and sounds and what they saw. But wonderful experiences. And just one last note here, because I think this goes for all of us, is that Gen Z is looking for something that I hope the rest of the planet is, which is transparency and commitment. In a very chaotic world, I hope that resonates with all of you as it does for me. Let's be more transparent. Let's let people know that we're committed to them. Once again, I'm your host, Dr. Rod Berger. Thanks for taking the plunge into HeadRoom, where we uncover the why behind the what and who impacting our lives. HeadRoom is a production of Rainlight and co-produced by our friends at Old Soul. I'm your host, Dr. Rod Berger, and this is HeadRoom.